Okay, I don't know about you, but I have learned so much today. This has been absolutely fantastic. I'm really, really thrilled at the quality of speakers that we have and just the information that's being imparted. And on that note, we're going to be doing, we're going to be continuing on. We're going to be delving into the world of climate finance and the crucial role that it plays in addressing climate challenges. And this session is in partnership with Ripple and BxC with Sarah, Peter, Dave, and Saif. Come on up to the stage. Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you, everyone. Do you need a mic? Here you go, my friend.
Hi, good to see you. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. How are you? We are so excited to be here today and to really deep dive in climate finance and transparency. My name's Dave Ford. I'm co-founder of BxC and one of our board directors. And yeah, welcome everyone. And then I think what I'd love to do to open up is just introduce our panelists and to allow you guys to tell everybody a little bit about what you're working on these days in the context of what we're talking about here today. So Saif, can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hopefully this is coming through clear. My name is Saif Bhatti. I'm the CEO of Renoster. Personally, I've been in climate and sustainability for about 9 years. Most of that has been working with large corporates and trying to understand what is our current footprint, how do we mitigate that, what role do offsets play, and I've seen a really the evolution, shall we say, of carbon credits from the inside. So today what we're doing is in a world where we have the Guardian article, where we have John Oliver, where we have all this criticism around the voluntary carbon market, how do we navigate that space? And Renoster's goal is to provide transparency on a project level to understand how much carbon there is in each credit, and then share that with our customers and with the general market so that we can navigate this space with some confidence.
Thanks so much, Saif, and Peter Rosberg, who's the carbon market product lead at Ripple.
Yeah, Peter Rosberg, carbon market. Swap time. Try that again. There we go. Peter Rosberg, I run carbon market product at Ripple. I'm also involved in Ripple's new venture, Centigrade.Earth, trying to build out the services that are necessary for the XRPL to support MRV data and carbon markets data. And at Centigrade, we're really interested in not only data transparency, but also leveling the playing field for a lot of these smaller projects that just don't have the technology infrastructure to be able to collect the data, manage their projects, and be able to reduce risk by showing that their success is going to be good in the markets.
Thanks, Peter. And Sarah Baxendell from Regen Network, their director of ecosystem.
Good morning, my name is Sarah. I've spent the last 15 years working in the climate impact space, primarily from the project development side, having been a former park designer for the city of Pittsburgh for 7 years, working with their climate action plan. At Regen Network, our goal is to empower communities to restore ecology and ecosystem function as our response to climate change. And so our community and our organization has developed a series of tools that allow for communities of practice, nonprofits on the ground, climate scientists at universities to design their own climate science methodologies, develop their own real-world projects, and then govern those standards on our custom blockchain that's built for this use case. So we are very much focused on climate science data, the governance of what it means to run a community impact project on the ground, as well as having effective issuance tools that can be both local and global in their impact scale.
Thank you so much. And Saif, you mentioned John Oliver, and you mentioned the Guardian article about Vera that happened earlier this year. So I think one of the big opportunities that Web3 has is to add a layer of transparency and trust into this completely complicated ecosystem. So I think addressing some of the biggest challenges and obstacles, and a lot of that is like just public perception and PR is super important. Can you guys give us and give the audience an idea of where the opportunities to help solve these challenges, come front and center?
Sure, I can touch base on that. So I think one of the core issues with the market today, as it pertains to carbon, is a lack of understanding of where the carbon actually is. How many credits are issued and how much carbon they represent is a central challenge that underpins a lot of the Guardian reporting, a lot of the John Oliver issue. They're taking aim at projects that are massive in scale and that don't have suitable architecture or technology to understand their financial flows. I think blockchain can be an opportunity to solve a lot of those issues. I think the other, when we're sitting up here on a panel talking about SDGs, and in particular talking about SDG number 11, which is specifically talking, sustainable communities, the money doesn't make it to the ground often enough in these projects. And I think that's something that blockchain can be exceedingly helpful in, is making sure those payments go directly to the people who are at the heart of these projects, no matter where they are.
Yeah, I'd add to that. The part of the problem with like the Guardian article and John Oliver is they're just focusing on carbon. And there are all these other SDGs that also need to be captured, either with a scientific methodology or proper tracking. So equity is one. Another one is biodiversity. A lot of these really great forestry projects are starting to look more at, hey, wait a minute, I have a biodiversity credit here that happens to generate carbon, as opposed to a carbon project that happens to have biodiversity. And so taking a look at the holistic picture and being able to document with a backed by science methodology for biodiversity, with proper on-chain tracking for payments for local communities and equity. I think that's really what's going to help reduce the risk of these projects that, like John Oliver said, well, this one burned down. Well, maybe it did burn down, but there was still a lot of progress that was made on the ground. It still really impacted the community. So there are other things that help reduce risk and show that a project is worthwhile.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, in the case of Regen Network, it's a little bit different. We are not just tokenizing Vera credits. Our open public goods infrastructure can be used by any registry. So Vera could use it for governing their standards, so could Gold Standard or Plan Vivo. But what we've developed with our climate science community is actually a brand new registry called Regen Registry. So all of our climate science methodologies go through peer review with university scientists and are coming out as new standards. And it's interesting with the pushback this year from, John Oliver and the Guardian article with Vera. That's a lot of the reason that these project developers and climate scientists have actually left Vera to use our tools. And clear examples of that is ERA Brazil, which is a long-standing Red Plus developer, has left Vera and are doing a biodiversity methodology on our registry. Moss is in the process of leaving Vera as well, in order to have their version of Red Plus that's custom built for their use cases in Brazil on our registry. So you are seeing that there is a migration away from the centralized standards because of the quality issues that have been called out with some of the programs. And that a lot of these longstanding project developers that are really doing amazing ecological impact work on the ground, they want the ability to design more custom methodological use cases. They want the ability to adapt those use cases. They want the ability to self-govern their programs. And so you're really seeing an evolution in the marketplace. That this article called out something that was, been underway for 2 or 3 years, this sort of migration into self-sovereign governance of standards development and climate science development on the ground.
Thanks, guys. I mean, it's interesting going to COP every year, and it, to some degree, you feel like you're on a hamster wheel. It's the same accounting, big 5 companies reporting the same things, missing the same marks. And it's interesting when you start to talk about scope 2 and scope 3, because it's just a massive, massive challenge. And that if you're asking chief sustainability officers what it's keeping them up at night, it's scope 2 and scope 3. And when you look at MRV and you look at blockchain and you look at like the open transparency, I mean, I love the analogy that it's like accounting software 5.0, and that it can help keep these big companies honest. where they currently aren't being held to that sort of standard. So I'm curious, like, where do you feel like the innovation is with this technology, or some specific examples that can move the CSO of a Fortune 500 company to realize why they want to make sure their carbon and biodiversity credits are backed in blockchain? Where, if you guys could just bring up any sort of, feel free to jump in, but like where the innovation is right now.
With the risk of offending the CFOs in the room, because I love y'all, I think it's really interesting that we're moving from the CSO to the CFO in terms of like carbon accounting and how I'm tracking the scope 3 emissions. And I think this data transparency platforms, ways to actually track through your entire supply chain, the carbon credits and how they apply, so that you're doing insetting as well as offsetting. I think there's some really cool technology that's starting to come on board. And I think a lot of the technology we're currently using with blockchain and the voluntary markets is really applicable to insetting and tracking your scope 3 emissions.
Thanks, Peter.
I think there's been a dearth of confidence this year after all that reporting that came out. And one of the benefits to CFOs and people who manage risk within large corporates will be, where is my credit originating from, and what is the tracked flows of the project developers' baseline numbers all the way to my desk and making a decision on whether or not I want to buy those credits. I think we've not seen the promise of blockchain turn into actual benefits to that supply yet, but I think it's an opportunity that could exist. It could be used. I think much of the work that Regen is doing is actually in this vein. What my question would be is where are the demand drivers? Because it seems as though we have a chicken and egg problem, right? We have a market that needs confidence, but in order to instill confidence, you need interest. And so how do you jumpstart that cycle after such criticisms have been levied in this space? And hopefully that's what we're trying to provide at Renoster, is provide some project level transparency on what you can buy, what quality it would be, and how much carbon you'd actually get. So those are questions that I'm curious to hear more.
Yeah, I think to add to this, these are really great points. From my perspective, from a financial perspective, the quality of the credit really comes down to what's the data provenance and the standard underneath of it. And in the origination software we're building, it's not just about what's the quality of the climate science standard and who governs it. And I do think the ability to govern standards on chain is itself a very valuable trend for innovation of science itself. But when you open up that asset, wherever it goes, you should be able to see the entire data trail. And that's data attestation from who uploaded soil samples, who is my monitor. That monitor is a verified identity, similar to the panel we heard earlier. What does the true data provenance of that credit look like? And how do we get out of this world of giant PDFs where you have to search through things with Control F to try to find the data? It's truly a terrible experience. And how do you get into structured data in a way where any credit that comes onto a blockchain has the right appropriate structured data? You can view that same structured data across any blockchain. You can put all the structured data into data oracles. You can analyze it at a much deeper level. You can have a much deeper conversation and actually qualify that it is indeed a better asset. And from my perspective, the digitalization of that data set, the ability to, wherever that credit goes, open it up like a little egg at Easter and say, here's all the pieces of the puzzle, and here's everyone who participated in that supply chain origination process, and here's that place on Earth, and have full transparency of that data is really critical. And when we have partnered with large corporates, our first sale of credits produced from our system is actually to Microsoft for their moonshot goal. One of the values we've also found on the other side, which has to do with the demand side, which I do actually think is the problem right now, is the demand side. It's when you have these public profiles of these corporations where anyone can go, anyone can see what was retired in their name, anyone can find that credit, anyone can open that credit and look at its data, and it's not just hidden in a, a PR report or some sort of financial report that you have to dig through for reporting. It's right there on the platform. And if you know the link and they've claimed their user profile, you can literally go open up Microsoft's history of what they've done for the moonshot goal at the data level. So really broadening the data transparency across both sides of the supply chain, I think, is really critical at this point to restore market confidence. But at the end of the day, if your credit is based off a standard that's old or ineffectual, or the baseline requirements are wishy-washy, it's not going to be a great credit. So we really come back to what's climate science mean to us, and how do we develop effective standards from a climate science perspective? And then how do you really dig into what the governance of those standards looks like, and how communities of practice on the ground are really benefiting from that governance structure?
Let's double click on data and transparency sort of writ large. Now, how far are we now, completely taking in that this is available today, but how far are we from having widespread acceptance with respect to sort of how Web 2 integrates with carbon credits? Like, how much further do we need to go? And how do we get there?
I think it depends on what we're specifically referring to. There's certainly plenty of, credits on the blockchain. Really, other than Regen network, they all come from the existing standards. So it's really just a tokenization step onto the blockchain, which does help from a tracking markets perspective. It doesn't necessarily anchor the data as effectively, and I think that we're moving into that sphere. So it really depends on how we're unpacking the conversation as to where we're at and what has value. And if we're not upgrading existing legacy standards with on-chain data attestation from an origination standpoint, we aren't strengthening, those standards and those requirements. And if we aren't making that the new industry requirement, that you've really got to have this public data thread, it doesn't really push the paradigm, and you end up with a handful of organizations like Regen Network, where we're designing that public data set paradigm and public governance paradigm from the start. So I think we are really evolving into having to ask ourselves, how do we bring in, the Watersheds and the Microsofts and the Ripples and the, some of the buy-side development partners to co-design what these new data standards need to be, co-design what that public transparency requirement is, and also co-design what climate science and data and reporting need to be, so that all the projects across the industry, no matter what registry they're coming from, are really pushing that paradigm so that it's a lot more confidence in the claim and the system, because we're dealing with a challenge of the system being something that people trust at the moment.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I think plug for GBBC. GBBC is doing a great job with the IWA token taxonomy framework and the voluntary ecological markets. It's a lot of stuff to say all at once. Data framework that's out there. So if you haven't seen that, that's worth checking out. It provides like a wrapper around the carbon credits, then you can easily explain them, and then it's an interoperable way to communicate about credits, which helps deal with this 200-page PDF problem that we're all trying to address today. Another really interesting data framework project that I think we're allowed to talk about it now, but it's more officially launching next week, is the ecological benefits framework. BxC is very involved in that and helping with that project, but it's taking a look at, what's the framework we need to express information on biodiversity and equity and air and water and soil and carbon. And I think it's helping, again, put this kind of overall interoperable way of communicating about things, and then backing it by saying, and we like these methodologies, like what Regen's developing, and Regen's very involved in that EVF project as well. So I think there's some really promising interoperable things that are going to be super useful moving forward in making this more consumable than the 200-page PDFs we have today.
Saif, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'm actually going to be the Debbie Downer a little bit in this conversation, because I think we're far away from having tokenization be a recognized mainstream method of receiving and dealing with carbon credits. And I think there's been, you have to acknowledge the massive blunders that have been made in the space where, companies have decided to take a wide swath of the market and tokenize that without regarding quality as an important characteristic of those credits, right? Without understanding quality, what you've essentially done is taken a lot of really bad credits, maybe some good credits, and then wash them all together as good, as just uniquely the same or the same. And I think, investigating some of the incentives for people in the space, the registries that we mentioned earlier, for Gold Standard and others, what do they stand to gain from tokenization? I don't know that they stand to gain much other than the loss of their loss of control over the manual processes that they have today. I know that others in the room might feel differently about Vera, but from our perspective, they've done a lot to push us back in terms of climate transparency, and the 600-page PDFs and longer that we constantly have to read for every project evaluation are not going anywhere if Vera gets its way. So that's kind of my contrarian perspective on the utility of this. I think it can be used effectively, but it hasn't been so far.
Well, I agree 100% actually, in the pooling, the tokenization pooling that's happening. I think that's very risky, right? So one of the things that at Ripple and also at Centigrade we're looking at is we believe there's a place where you're pooling projects together, but to your point, that makes it very risky, because now there's a tendency for people to say, okay, well, I'm going to get some, to put it in bond perspective, like, I've got my A+, AA bonds, and then I've got my, B or C bonds that are just there to fill up the token pool. And I believe that's super risky, right? So we actually believe in tokenizing down to the carbon credit, where it's the project and the vintage and the specific methodologies that are being used. Because you want to be able to click on that token. I think Regen's the same way, right? You want to be able to click on that project and say, okay, what's the specific MRV data that supports this? And if you start pooling them all together, then it's like, well, I don't know what, I just bought some carbon credits, but they could be, a monocrop rubber plantation, or it could be a really good biodiverse agroforestry project, and you just don't know. So I agree 100%. I think tokenize at the very specific level, but don't do a lot of pooling. That's too risky.
I have a slightly different perspective on it, actually, which seems ironic because Regen does issue credits semi-fungibly. So it's the project vintage credit batch, actually, is the combination of the issuance. I think there are use cases where pooling tokens on a portfolio basis makes a lot of sense. And a clear example is Moss. They have a number of different projects using the same standard in Brazil on Regen Network. And there will be, 500,000 of these tons this year, in potentially even a couple of weeks they're issued. And they could be the same single token if they want them to on the fungibility basis, and really reflect the same year, the same standard. They're just slightly different properties. So from an aggregated projects perspective, if you have large enough volume, I think it is a valuable tool from a portfolio management perspective. I think it's a question of whether carbon credits should be used as a DeFi tool. That's maybe where I think you head into the gray area of, does that actually have value for climate impact? But we do a lot of, derivatives investments, as a financial industry where these types of mechanisms already happen. So I think having the functionality is very important, but at the end of the day, we're trying to ask ourselves, are we making real impact on the ground? Are we financializing new project development? Are we drawing down more carbon? Can you see the data of the project? You can't just tokenize credits and throw them into a pile and say that some of them were great and some of them weren't great, and have any level of transparency around them, any level of data control. So there are different use cases for different things. And this is where I think that the flexibility of blockchain from a design perspective and an asset management perspective is a sort of a paradigm of asset management and design that we haven't really pushed into in the same way that we could. And knowing that gold standard is tokenizing, the wave is shifting onto blockchain, and Regen is blockchain native. So I get excited for when more people are actually coming and using the tools, because I do think that the market has to be more transparent, and blockchain to me is really the only way we get a public goods infrastructure, a public data set, public verification of these assets in a way where you can really run machine learning on it and do, the effective data analysis that you do on projects, do it really fast, get the rating systems in there, really be able to compare the assets really efficiently. We need more efficiency in this market in order for it to work for the demand side partners more effectively.
I was going to say gold standard is definitely leading the way, so I'll give you that. And I totally agree with your points about it, and echoing one of the original speakers this morning. The technology is not good or bad; it's how you use it that matters. And I think there are examples of using tokenization and redemption cycles effectively. If I'm going to get 0.29 tons of carbon per credit, which is something that we produce. And therefore, you might want to buy 3 times as many credits from that project in order to get your full ton of carbon. I think that's a perfectly suitable use case for tokenization. Makes a ton of sense. So,
I think sometimes we can very easily get into the sort of deep tech side of what we're doing here. And one of the most powerful experiences that I've had in the last couple of years of being in this space is actually via Regen Network and a project that they have, Inti's project in Ecuador. So maybe I wanted to just open that. Maybe that could just be a good way to tell the story of how a real world community has been affected by working with Web3. I mean, Inti, I met him actually in Greenland a year and a half ago, and he is deep in the Ecuadorian, one of the most biodiverse places on Earth that was being infringed on by mining and mining forces. And we just heard that his entire area was protected. So can you maybe tell that short story and how real world tech intersects directly with people on the ground in really important places on Earth?
Yeah, so I can't actually speak to this particular project, but our organization, through our founder Gregory, has very strong relationships with the Amazon Headwater tribes, and was just down there with Planet Labs and other folks supporting people understanding how they could use our tools to design their own standards. But an example that I am very familiar with is a group called Colshan Carbon Trust in the state of Washington. They're a biochar carbon land trust, very, very small, literally one place where they're pulling, all the downed wood out of a forest. They're doing biochar pyrolysis and then issuing biochar credits and putting the biochar back in the forest. And what's been really great, working with groups like that is, some of these projects are very, very small. They're doing very hyper-local climate science. They're doing pilot projects, and you get a first investment from a buyer side partner, and then they're able to massively scale their implementation pilot network. And they're using the tools that we have from a climate science perspective to design their own methodology. So they're doing that climate science while they're doing those pilot projects. They're going through peer review. And they, as a local community, have the ability to govern that standard, to have the administration over that standard, to be able to issue the credits off those standard or assign issuance permissions to others. And so you get a programmatic series of actual registry function, as well as the governance of those standards. And on our system, we've just added a new layer of functionality we call the groups. So now you can establish advisory councils with multiple groups of climate scientists that govern a specific set of methodologies. You can take advisory councils from local communities that, are like the Parks Council, and the Parks Council can govern the project and how it's implemented. So you get into these layers of governance that align with municipal planning, with state planning, with climate action plans in cities. And it really allows you to take the way that we already think and function in communities and put that governance and communication layer on chain. So it's been fascinating watching all the different examples, there's over 40 methodologies in Regen, and they're all over the world and all different use cases, from biochar to biodiversity to soil organic carbon. Communities of practice are really developing things for themselves on the ground and taking ownership at this point.
Peter and Saif, any real world stories you'd like to share to help bring it to life for the audience?
So many stories. I think double clicking down on like methodologies and like, but part of the problem we have today is just things are happening so fast, both in the nature-based space and in the technology space, that having digital methodologies that make it easier to author, that it make it easier to have engagement with indigenous population, or make it easier to engage with the DSci community, or the science, distributed science community, is super important. And I think Regen's doing some great stuff in that front and being able to promote the new methodology development. On Ripple's side, we've worked a lot with projects that maybe don't quite have approval, or we believe they're going to have approval soon from one of the big registries, but we're willing to support them in their self-certification and their proposal of new methodologies. And I think that's super important. So going from nature-based for a minute to more technology-based, we're working with a company called Carbon Cure, and they're doing storage of CO2 and cement. And that took them a long time to go through the process of saying, okay, here's how we're tracking our supply chain. Here's how we're balancing out how much carbon we're offsetting or emitting versus what we're offsetting. Here's the waste calculations and everything. And we were willing to support them and work with them while they were still getting a methodology developed. Another example is New Light, where they're actually capturing methane from abandoned coal mines and other energy projects, where they're taking that methane, they're capturing it. As you know, methane is a really bad greenhouse gas, and then they're actually creating a plastic substitute. So you're holding this plastic fork or this plastic straw. It's not really plastic, it's actually carbon negative. And even when it decomposes in a nice, safe way, it's emitting far less carbon than what was captured by capturing that methane. Again, they didn't have an approved methodology at first. So being able to get access to financing or to sell forwards or to get advanced market commitments by saying we support this, and here's the data that they have on chain for you to publicly review, I think is really opening up the world. And I think blockchain can do a lot of that by just having that all there publicly available for anybody to see.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, I can talk about our perspectives from specifically we're in the nature-based space, so we're looking at forestry, mangroves, and peat bogs, and we've seen incredibly effective projects that diminish in scale and size. I think one of the, going back to the original points about these mega projects that take place that generate 30, 40, 50 million credits, when we've seen projects that are on the farm level, intimately on the community level, where we have increased stakeholdership, there is a person at the other end of it. I think those have been the best projects that we've seen, that, for example, the TIS program in India and in Kenya, those programs are paying smallholder farmers in the countryside regions of India and Kenya to protect and grow their trees. And the question that I'd like to kind of raise back to you is, much of that hasn't happened directly through blockchain. I think it could, but the question is, and I think it was touched on in a previous conversation about digital identity, many of these farmers, I mean, they can leverage things like, direct mobile money payments, but how do they deal with, smart devices, bank accounts, the internet in places that don't have such infrastructure? I think we can see blockchain roll out in regions that are more developed, but I think typically the bleeding edge of climate change action and where these effective small projects can take place doesn't align well with an existing infrastructure. So I'm curious about the panelists' thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that these are tools that the industry at large needs to develop in a way that are more globally accessible. I mean, you have a lot of mobile like financial applications that do reach people in the global south that are blockchain based. There's a number of them on Celo and other stablecoin applications. I think that you see the start of this. And at Regen, we have a functionality called data module where you can upload data. So we have partners because we're USDA funded historically with folks like FarmOS and RSI, where you have a mobile app in the field. You can be offline, you can put your data in the app, and when it connects back to the internet, it will upload it to our blockchain to your project. So there are already tools that people are using that help the experience of the project developers on the ground if they are really small. But data accessibility, internet accessibility, identity accessibility, I think are equations that go, I think, maybe beyond the work that we three do. And that's where I think really partnering across other people that are developing these blockchain solutions and finding integrations for our application layers to have that functionality is really the next wave, is finding out all the missing functionality that makes the systems accessible to everyone, which is part of why our standards governance and issuance governance perspective on our credit issuance is designed that if you have these communities on the ground, that they are the ones that can be in charge of those decisions for themselves. And so when they can be in charge of uploading their science data, they can be in charge of their payment fee distribution in a meaningful way on their phones, then you can really get all the way around an accessibility story.
Yeah, I'd say at Centigrade in particular, we're really thinking about a lot of the other places in conjunction with Ripple also thinking about this, which is there's other things that need to be figured out, and the blockchain is starting to be a great solution for the developing world to do that. So you also have to prove that you've got the title for the land. You've also have to prove that you've distributed payments effectively to the indigenous community. You have to show that there's been involvement and participation. And there's so many interesting Web3 models that are coming out that are solving those problems. So I think it's not just getting the stuff on chain. And yes, there are accessibility problems with, how do you connect to the internet? Some places the only place you can do is with a Starlink, and how many people have a Starlink wandering around in the forest, right? But all of those things are providing this distributed infrastructure that really makes it much more effective in being able to prove ownership, be able to prove participation. So I think that's a lot of stuff we have to figure out beyond just putting the MRV data for the credit on, and those are all very important as well.
I mean, I think it's interesting. It's like it's like paradoxical that this technology can drive true trust and transparency, yet that perceived lack of trust and transparency with the crypto space writ large is kind of what's holding us back. It feels like when I'm asking these questions, it's like, where's the leverage, and how do we sort of change the zeitgeist, because this technology is so important and really should be synonymous with verification. And I think there's sort of some big macro, which is called Bitcoin energy challenges, that sort of come into the policy landscape and causes so much confusion. I'm just curious, how do you guys think we can solve some of this confusion with the masses and really have blockchain be synonymous with its core function and measurement, trust and verification?
So I think we have to stop using the word crypto because it's tacky and speculative. It's just my personal opinion. Blockchain is a software technology. It is a public governance, public goods infrastructure at its core. If your blockchain is public. So ultimately, we're talking about software that's decentralized and publicly accessible. And that is a paradigm shift. And so I think where I focus my energy is really the public goods use cases, the DAOification tools, the community governance tools, the data provenance layer, the public accessibility of trade information. These are really valuable use cases for blockchain. And I actually think that blockchain is really well suited for climate science data, for DeSci, for public data sets that you want to do research on. And at the end of the day, if we continue to have, at least for the climate impact sphere, partially private data, partially public data, it will be nearly impossible to reconcile against national determined contributions and corporate commitments and actual projects on the ground and who takes claim for things in the Paris Accord. If it's not a public data set, how are we going to have accounting that what we're saying is real, is true, and then really track our collective global progress to drawing down carbon and balancing our atmosphere? So I think we need to focus on blockchain as a software tool with real world use cases, and get culturally away from blockchain as a speculative mechanism.
Thank you for that. You guys got anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think that I think the best thing the blockchain can do is fade into the background and let the outcomes that it drives take the front and center stage. I think that many of the topics that we've covered today, the fact that it can lead to effective stakeholdership, it can lead to payments, it can lead to climate science being more transparent, are all extremely valid. And then that should be the story, not we're using blockchain for this, or we're using the technology. It's a means to an end, not an end unto itself. So.
Yeah, totally agree. We're just in that awkward part of the beginning of a technology where we talk about the technology as much as we talk about the problems we're solving. I mean, nobody's sitting at conferences today talking about how cool TCP/IP is or HTTPS is, right? You know, they're talking about the cool applications you built on top of that Web2 solution. And it's the same for blockchain. I mean, my kid is just going to think about the fact, oh, there's data hanging out there in a distributed way that we access, and here's all the cool apps that we have on top of that. And yeah, it's not, Centigrade is all about just trying to figure out how we abstract that all away so that it's all there. And people have ownership of what they create without making it, you know, connecting 6 wallets and keeping a seed phrase and all those other things that are hopefully going to go away very soon.
You're making me think of myself at like age 12 compared to blockchain. Just super awkward and trying to figure out how to get through. It's interesting because you think about ESG reporting, which has become like this woke thing that's problematic, you know, to a lot of folks on the right. But then there's also, I think, problems with folks on the left when you think about, all right, how do you verify ESG claims? And this technology has like a real world opportunity to really like be to validate all these claims that, you know, I think everybody hopes are, there's a lot of hopes and dreams that go into these ESG reportings that they're accurate, but there is definitely a delta. So, you know, I love the way, certainly, you know, just decoupling blockchain from crypto, and even like going a layer further, and not, like you said, not getting to the point where we're not even talking about blockchain, where it's just synonymous is super key. We have about 10 minutes left, so I'm curious what else is on your mind. You know, the three of you, what's keeping you guys up at night, and what's making you feel really, really good about where you are and what you're doing? Maybe if you could start with the pain and then go to where you're feeling grateful to be working in the space.
Yeah, I think from the perspective of our project developer community that are doing the real world work on the ground and going through the long process of climate science and peer review, ultimately their needs rest on, you know, partners like a Ripple that are willing to take a look at new climate science and willing to make investments into real world projects. So, you know, it's largely a demand challenge. From a technical perspective, because I'm actually rather technical, I spend a lot of time thinking about, you know, we have a lot of siloed infrastructure layer of blockchain and applications that, you know, are on different chains doing climate science work, working in a specific niche, and that there's a middleware challenge to making all of our work together. And I do think when you can start to weave together, Regen credits and the Guardian on Hedera and, the work on Ripple, and you can get all of these application layers to work together. And when you can get past the siloed wallets of Kepler and MetaMask and all the rest of the walleting challenges, you can create a unified user experience across the entire blockchain where no matter what part of the origination to the buy side that you're participating on, the interoperability of the application layer is limited by the interoperability of infrastructure layer. And there's a lot of middleware design that needs to be designed and implemented over the next 2 years to really create an industry-wide movement. Because I do largely think, as a person with a finance background, that we're going to be exiting sort of a corporate sustainability paradigm where you're purchasing for retiring for your carbon neutrality claim. I do think we're going to be moving into more of these are assets on the balance sheet and more of a carbon-backed economy and more of a shift in our perspective of what, at least with nature-based solutions, what's really the value of this work in the real world. So I actually think that the user experience in 2-3 years is going to feel radically differently and almost not have the user know like what branded product it's on or what blockchain that's anchored on. I think it's going to be a much more outcome-based use case where all of our work has to work together.
I mostly worry about money. And I think you're getting to it, right? I mean, we need to do this radical, we all know we have to do this radical capital shift from this, money-based economy to a carbon-based economy. We should be doing, carbon stress tests on our major institutions. And we've got to start driving more investment into pretty much any type of project out there that's going to help, whether it's offsetting, insetting, reducing scope 3, all of that has to happen and all that requires money. And so anything that we can do to document projects, in their early infancy of saying, okay, this is what I'm already doing, so I can reduce the risk and knowing that I can invest in this project and I'll get credits, paid back to me, or green bonds that are paid off and carbon credits as opposed to in dollars. There's so many smaller countries out there that have huge environmental assets and huge carbon assets that are just not even on their balance sheet. It's criminal. It's a total flipping, and that's the kind of stuff that I worry about, is like, how do we get that money to happen? Let's get beyond. I love advanced market commitments, but I'd like people to actually write checks as opposed to just saying, I will buy your stuff in the future. And I think that's the thing that really keeps me up at night, building all of the tools on chain that help make that a reality by saying, look, this is a good investment, or look, this project is real, it's legit, and they're collecting the data. That's what I want to do.
Thanks, Peter. Saif?
Yeah, I think the things that keep me up at night are the concerns of our customers, that are corporates, that are traders, that are folks working within the VCM and trying to understand what alphabet soup disclosure schedule they'll have to adhere to next week. And I think that's a case of an industry that's still trying to find its footing after a lot of criticism. But what's exciting to me is the amount of dry powder that is sitting on the sidelines that is waiting to be deployed into the high quality projects that we know can and do exist. And so finding and sorting through those and creating new ones is, especially in those developing nations, as Peter mentioned, that's I think the amazing challenge of the next 8 years or so as we ramp up to net zero commitments coming online and getting there. Whether that takes the guise of carbon neutrality, which probably won't be the case, or nature positive, or whatever the label is, I think the reality is we need to protect nature, we need to conserve nature, and we need to restore and regenerate nature. And the powder that's sitting there can do that if leveraged in the right way.
Amen to that. One of the, I don't know what's going on with the microphones, but talking more about interoperability in that 3-year, hope and dream that you like, what's it going to take, and how are we going to be able to harness all these different companies to come together and be interoperable for the greater good?
Yeah, so the product studio I'm launching is meant to solve this problem. So I think part of it is your wallet experience. You need to be able to unify all the blockchain wallets and then frankly abstract them away with a normal user experience. Part of it, I think, is integrating blockchain through Web2 APIs to platforms like a Patch or a Cloverly that are just not blockchain, and that's fine. But part of it, I think, is really that you have this issue of individual projects being semi-fungible, and most technical bridges from, Regen network to Polygon to Celo to Ethereum to Ripple to Solana, that the bridges are for fungible tokens, not semi-fungible. So if you want to actually issue a project on Regen network and then transfer it to Ethereum, there needs to be a registry sitting there that can accept that level of data and credit. I also think that there are application pieces missing around, automated offsetting wallets, like integrating a multi-data sphere from a user experience. And I think the user experience in a couple of years masks all of that entirely, where you just sort of come into one little area that says, I want to do X, and it executes across many different paradigms and applications. So it's sort of unified application layer with near to no user experience, because you're just executing the final transaction at the application layer functionality. But that's a very technical answer, because I'm a bit more technical in my product integration design than the average person is. So I apologize.
Any closing thoughts on interoperability, Peter and Saif?
Yeah. I mean, we got to have it, right? And we in the carbon markets, and in particular, we've got a lot of semi-fungible assets. So you've got to be able to figure out a way to deal with, this specific project with this specific MRV that was, credits generated in this year, how you can compare them and do price discovery with another project in the same region or a completely different region, or technology based versus a non-technology based. And then how do you collect all that data, but also how do you collect those assets? I mean, we're talking about millions of dollars worth of assets. So, for people whose eyes are glazing over when we're talking about wallets and, on-chain accounts, I mean, you got to have a safe way to store what is, like, Ripple has like $30 million worth of assets right now. That we got to be able to store those in a safe and secure way with, custodial functionality and everything else. So it's all super important that we have this be interoperable, or we're not going to be able to trade it to the next person that wants to use it.
Final words, Saif. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the rest of the panelists. Interoperability is essential, but what's stopping us from understanding price action is cutting down on the fragmentation that's taking place in the market, and putting everything on a 100-year or 50-year, or however, pick a standard, essentially, how much carbon is there on this time scale, and then comparing solutions based on that. I think that's something that we're going to continue to see scale, and that'll help people wade through whether they want to use an engineered removal or a nature-based removal. And I think that that's only a good thing.
Well, we are at the end of our panel today, and I want to thank the three of you so much for sharing your insight. And just on a final note, I mean, we've been in some conversations with some of the biggest payment companies in the world, and I think it's interesting the opportunity for enabling the Web2 infrastructure leaders to really dial in to how we could come together around the carbon markets and biodiversity credits, and how their operability goals can really be harnessed and driven through this specific, through Web3 technology, through MRV, and through blockchain. So with that said, thank you all so much. We really appreciate it.